Thank you, Jane, and welcome to Emma. I think if you go back in time to the 1960s, it was large infrastructure projects, especially motorways, that alerted many people in this country to the amount of sites of various periods that there were, and the ease with which they could be destroyed in projects such as motorways slicing across the countryside, essentially all forms of development, whether it was within towns or beyond them, and of course the removal of material through extraction in the ground to build motorways and other things as well. And that forced a lot of the pressure to eventually build archaeology into schemes. And it's quite interesting indeed tonight that we're going to be looking at another infrastructure project, it's a big one, which most people will be well aware of, HS2, where essentially archaeology is built firmly into the scheme of things, so that sites are evaluated and where necessary, examined and recorded before their development along the line and alongside essentially the new track, the new HS2 scheme. And tonight we've got Emma Tetlow along, and Emma is going to talk about that work in the London Borough of Hillingdon. Hillingdon, of course, has seen big infrastructure projects before, particularly those associated with the airport. And we're going to see a lot. I think Emma has subtitled the lecture Sites from the Mesolithic to the Medieval. It will just show you, I think, how much does survive, how much can be recorded, what essentially we will be able to learn about past periods through that, and how easily these sites could, if this development had taken place 30, 40 years ago, have been destroyed without record. I think that's enough for me to introduce Emma. We're very pleased she's doing this first lecture of 2022. So Emma, can I hand over to you, please? Oh, yes. Are you there?
Thank you very much, Harvey, and thank you for inviting me to talk this evening. We've got, I'm working in an operational office, and we've got a little bit of health and safety work going on around me, so that's where you might hear a little bit of background noise at the moment. But anyway, as I say, I'm here, as Harvey says, I'm here to talk about the archaeology of Hillingdon, and I hope you'll find this quite interesting. I'll give you a bit of background in terms of the project and the area that we're responsible for and how actually HS2 set up first, and then we'll look at the archaeology that we've encountered while we've been working in this area. And I should say I've been responsible for the archaeology in the London Borough of Hillingdon since February 2018, so I'm just a month shy of 4 years working in this area, and we've had some really exciting. It's been a fantastic place of work during the past 4 years. So just to give you an idea about how HS2 is set up, this gives you an overview of Area South. Now HS2 is actually, for the purposes of the construction, split into three areas, and also it's now subdivided as well into stations and other bits and pieces of infrastructure. So overarching, we have Area North, which is the bit towards Birmingham. The bit in the middle going through the Chilterns is Area Central, and we're actually in Area South. And the railway itself is actually being built from Birmingham to London, and the headquarters are actually in Birmingham. So my area is split into three. I have Area East, which is a lot of built heritage. So we're looking at sort of things like Mornington Street Bridge and Park Village. We have interface to the Crown Estates in Camden. Area Central, we don't have so much because this tends to be largely tunnels and was dealt with by CSJV, which is, I should have explained that, the precursor to SCS. The works are actually split into two, so we have CSJV, which I'll also talk about, which is Costain Skanska joint venture, which actually undertook the enabling works, and a lot of the initial archaeological works that we're getting built on, but already discussed and I'm building on currently with SCS. And I also work for CSJV. And also SCS Railways, who are now responsible for the construction side. So we have Area Central, which was Kensal Green, largely Kensal Green Cemetery, and initially proposed Westgate vent shaft, which unfortunately didn't have the archaeological potential that we thought it might have. And then Area West, which is the London Borough of Hillingdon, and we have a number of sites in this area: West Rytwick Golf Course, the Northern and Southern Sustainable Placements, which is the where the material from the tunnels, the North Op tunnels, is going to be deposited, and the realignment of Harville Road, and a number of other smaller pieces of work that are all sort of tied in to this area. So to give you an idea, HS2, which is obviously the High Speed Rail Act and Acts of Parliament, has its own legislation for the management of the cultural heritage that sits within the construction land requirement, which is the area in which the railway will be built. This is based on a number of environmental minimum requirements that were determined prior to the actual act, which actually form part of the Act. The Heritage Memorandum, which is one of the instruments by which this work is, the historic environment and this work is curated. And then the actual instrument that is outlines what we'll do and how we'll do it is the generic written stream of investigation for the Historic Environment Research Delivery Strategy, which is GWSI HERDS, which is, shall we say, so to speak, the Bible of all the work that we do across HS2. It provides us a framework and the techniques that we can use, or other techniques that we can use on discussion with HS2, also how the work will be undertaken, what we're looking to deliver, and also provides us, which is what I'm sort of going to come down to now, what's known as knowledge creation objectives. As a result of this, we get continuity and consistency of process, methods and investigation across the route. So what happens in North West and Central is replicated across the whole area. So we have, as I say, a consistent and sensible approach to the work that we undertake, and it guides our decision-making processes. Now, the knowledge creation objectives, which I'll come to in more detail in a subsequent slide, give us a criteria, almost a framework by which to work, and a specific questions directed on a regional, national and local level. And also, throughout the process of work, we've actually been able to determine further knowledge creation objectives where a particularly good example is the work in St James's Gardens undertaken by one of my colleagues, whereby they've determined, sorry about this, three other sort of knowledge creation objectives associated with burial grounds and the assessments of human remains. And what this aims to do is to give a strategic approach to identifying and managing archaeological sites. As it suggests here, do less but do it better, to be critical about what we're doing, is there anything are there any non-intrusive techniques that we can use ahead of intrusive works to determine the presence absence of archaeology, enhanced geophysics. There's a new technique that's being used on some sites called where it's handheld X-ray fluorescence, which will determine what sort of components of the soil is the lead. Are we looking at concentrations of sort of any sort of element that may determine human activity, such as concentrations of iron working. Again, it's been very, very useful across other areas, and we're hoping actually to use it in Hillingdon as part of the works we're going to undertake shortly. And the one exception to this that I will talk about is West Rytwick Golf Course is actually subject to a town and country planning application. And obviously, a town and country planning application sits within common law. It's a normal part of the planning process, and we've been given permission by the stakeholder to look at this as we would do critically under the HERDS criteria, again for continuity and consistency across the area. Now, whilst some of the works sit within the High Speed Rail Act, there are a number of particularly which sit within common law, which have been incorporated as schedules within the High Speed Rail Act. Hello, yes?
Well, I just interrupt. A lot of people are rather finding it extremely difficult. Is there any way you can ask these guys if they kindly move on, or at least pick up, because you could say you're doing a lecture.
I can do.
Sorry, everybody, but I think that's probably the best thing to do.
Could you do that? Absolutely.
So just hang on for a minute. We'll see if Emma can put these guys out.
Hello, I'm back. They've agreed to move. So back to where we were. So the legal requirements of HS2. So we have a number of schedules that incorporate sort of aspects of what is actually part of common law. Can you still see the screen I'm sharing?
Yep.
Excellent. So Schedule 20 deals with burial grounds and again effectively replaced the Burial Act of 1857. Schedule 19, which looks at scheduled ancient monuments, which with all the best intentions, HS2 has been designed to avoid, in some cases it cannot, is the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act of 1979. Schedule 18 replaces listed building consent with what we call heritage assessment method statements, which actually are equally as complex as obtaining listed building consent, and a number of undertakings and assurances, which are specific agreements made with stakeholders such as the local London boroughs and third parties, which were determined at the hybrid bill stage, and they need to be discharged, but can be a little esoteric in some cases, as it suggests. Now, one of the common piece of legislation that sits within common law that has not been disapplied is the Treasure Act of 1996. That still applies to HS2, wherever we find something that is potentially treasure or not. And as you'll come to see as I go further into the presentation, we obviously found something in my area that was managed and legislated within that piece of common law. So anyway, I said I'd come on to the HERD's knowledge creation objectives. So what these were, and these are the ones that are particularly with particular reference to writing. And they're sort of, as I say, these are, you can see one here that we have refining and understanding the Paleolithic potential of deposits beyond river valleys. Well, we're in the Colne Valley. We sit to the east of the Colne Valley, and we have the New Year's Bourne, and we have the River Pin, where we've undertaken some work. And again, this goes on to sort of look at what we can do to contribute to existing research criteria, such as again looking at the proto-terms of the river, but not so much the river bottom in this area. But David Bridgham has said that in terms of the sort of the actual the rivers of the United Kingdom, the Thames and its tributaries, the Thames is well understood, but its tributaries are actually very poorly understood. We look at the density of prehistoric activity in the Colne Valley, which is actually in some areas we have quite a lot of evidence of it, and is this a bias? And it goes on sort of through these where we've actually selected these knowledge creation objectives on which to base our archaeological work. So anyway, let's come to the interesting part, which is the archaeology itself. So my area is known as Area West. This area is known as Areas West, and it is actually from West Ruislip Portal, which is just about here, which is at the golf course, all the way through to Harville Road, which stretches along this corridor here. This area now a line JV, and this is where the viaduct will be built. As I say, most of my area is tunnels, except for this area where we get the arising from the tunnels itself. So, as I indicated earlier, I've been working in this area for quite a while, and my first sort of role was with Costain Skanska joint venture, which undertook sort of a lot of the baseline work in the area. We had numerous areas, as you can see here. In terms of archaeology, this isn't particularly substantial tranches of work, and certainly not in relation to some of the work that's been undertaken up the way in Area Central. The majority of it actually based on sort of a number of techniques, which I'll come to discuss shortly, did involve trenching. So this area has been very sort of, I would say, well, relatively rigorously trenched actually. And we found some very interesting sort of bits and pieces as a result. To drive these works, we also undertook a detailed desk-based assessment which focused on the medieval landscape. The one thing that has started to manifest, that despite this area sitting within the M25 and a relatively well-developed part of sort of northwest London, is that the actual landscape in between the built-up areas has retained a lot of its medieval characteristics. And in some cases, this is obviously favourably worked in favour of the archaeology, and this is where we've got some of our most interesting finds from. So that is the work that we undertook for CSJV. As you can see, it's a number of trenching. And again, what's happened with SCS, which is obviously evolution, so that was the evaluation that's given us the sort of what archaeology we have there. It's characterised it, it's produced, we characterised it, we recorded it, and we've taken this forward now to look at, to see where we'd like to undertake further works. And as you can see, we've still got several areas left where we'll be continuing the work over the next couple of years as the railways are constructed. And as a result of the CSJV works, and some of the SCS works, we haven't undertaken that's particularly substantial tranches at the moment. We've started to develop a chronology for the area. It's one of the values, as Harvey said, of this large-scale infrastructure projects in terms of the archaeology, which is rigorously investigated, is that it gives us an opportunity to look at greenfield areas, which is actually really quite unusual. So it's, we're looking in fields where we wouldn't normally have the opportunity to sort of investigate, and it's yielded some fantastic results.
Yeah. Can I
Yes.
come in again? It's still an awful lot of noise. You're doing a lecture. There's 60 people trying to listen to it, and they're making it impossible. Sorry, I know it's a problem, but if you could, that would make it a lot easier for people.
If I could, sorry.
Yeah.
They're not anywhere near me. These people.
Well, there's still a lot of banging and making a lot of noise.
I can move to a meeting room, but unfortunately the meeting rooms are actually quite echoey.
Yeah, it's just about the guys can certainly.
Can you still hear me?
Hi, Emma.
Yeah.
What is the pickup for your microphone? Is your computer picking up the sound?
No, it's my headphones.
Yeah, there might be. Why don't you try in your sound system and select a different microphone if you can? See if that improves the sound pickup.
I think that actually might be worse because the computer will pick everything up, whereas I think
it's just because you must have a very powerful microphone and it's picking up, it's amplifying the external sounds.
Has that gone quieter? Because I can't hear much background noise now.
No, it's pretty loud. It's especially the talking. It's very. There's a lot of talking and right.
Yeah.
That should have improved. I'm so sorry, it's an operational office.
Emma, it hasn't improved at all. If you are able to go into an echoey office, that will be a lot better.
Right, okay, I'll have a go. Yeah,
I'm very sorry, Emma.
Thanks,
that's all right, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm very sorry for the interruptions. They weren't expecting this sort of level of activity at this time of night.
Perhaps we could take this moment to mention that we had been hoping before Christmas, before Omicron struck, that we might start thinking about going back to exploring in-person lectures. But at the moment, we've decided against that. So for the next couple of months, at least, we will be continuing with our lecture series online, just while things are, infection rates are high. So hopefully, whilst there are the drawbacks of not seeing each other in person, for the next couple of lectures at least, we will be sticking with the Zoom format. which does have some advantages, particularly on a wet Tuesday evening. So that's just to fill you in on that. Whilst we're waiting for Emma to get reconnected as well. This will be perhaps where Harvey and I could encourage anyone who's not a LAMAS member to consider the benefits of joining. The journal, which came out just before Christmas, is a fantastic read with some very good reports from our conferences, from research excavations, such as the epic excavation at Sion House, which was published in the last journal. And perhaps we could do a trailer also for the annual archaeology conference, which is coming up in March. So perhaps, Harvey, you could remind us what the date and the theme for that is.
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see if I can find anything in my diary on that, Jane. So, I must say this was I don't want to do a Boris Johnson here, but it was, while I'm shuffling through pages, but it was a hazard of Zoom lectures, which I hadn't really encountered until this evening. I will have to find another.
I'm encouraged to see that the engineers on High Speed 2 are working until 7 o'clock in the evening.
We're expecting the first train in about 2 hours, I think.
Tickets for the conference will be on sale from tomorrow. So keep an eye on our website.
Have you got the date there? Have you got the date? Let me just have a look.
It's normally something like the third Saturday. This is I've got it in my diary somewhere.
It is. It usually depends on one or two.
Harvey, I thought this would be written on your heart and soul.
Yeah, well, it is. And
It's Saturday, the 19th of March. It is Saturday, the 19th of March, from 10:30.
Okay, well done. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, and thank you, Richard.
Right, so we've got, yes, the date of the conference, and HS2 will feature in it as a national project. So there will be a chance to have many contributions on HS2 during the.
Welcome back, Emma.
Hello.
And there will be a range of talk. Yeah. Right. Okay.
So
we did some trailers while you were absent.
This could be quite accurate. The internet connection won't be as
Emma
good.
was very keen on the last slide, so could you start from there? Would that be all right?
Sorry, I'm struggling with the setup at the moment. 2 seconds.
That's
It's
fine.
all right. The internet will not be as good here.
You sound
You sound beautiful.
Yeah, much better where you are now.
Actually, I could probably
do
without those. But as you can hear, the reason I don't like these rooms is the echo. Mind you, if it was that bad in there today.
Yeah, this is
right. So which slide was it? Which slide have you got? Like me to go back to?
Just keep going through, and we'll tell you when to
chronology.
stop.
Thank you. No problem. Excellent. No problem at all. Got that. So chronology. So what we've got. So the chronology. We're actually in the process of determining quite a nice chronology. Actually, that hasn't moved, has it?
No, you need to get there.
No. Right. Hang on a minute.
Is it the share screen that we're looking for?
No, I have no screens at all now. I've only actually got one screen, whereas I had 3 screens in there. There's 3 screens in there. 2 seconds. Let me sort this out. I'm going to have to close that down again. Right, so that actually has, so we've got chronology now. So can you see that?
Not yet. No, you have shared?
Okay. Sure, no problem.
I know it's a bit difficult when you only have one screen and Zoom and presenting and everything else.
There you go. That should be all right. Actually, you should get the It's all right, there we go, just had to change the setup. So there we go, we've got the chronology. So what we've determined at the moment is we have possible evidence of Middle Paleolithic, which I'll come to in a moment. We have some fantastic Mesolithic long blades that we've discovered on a terrace of the River Pin at West Ruislip. And these are very similar. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the material from Denham and Three Ways Wharf and the Sanderson site. So we have evidence of Mesolithic, beautifully preserved, no evidence of reworking. The material is clearly from the site that it was worked on. The evidence for Neolithic is relatively limited, and it's got two areas there. It suggests we've got some at Ruislip Northern Sustainable Placement and West Ruislip Golf Course, but it's very sort of low levels and it's very dispersed. The early Bronze Age, interestingly, is absent. And then we have evidence of dispersed activity during the mid-Bronze Age, and then we get high concentrations towards the late Bronze Age. And in some areas we've encountered sort of evidence of very sort of scattered field systems and sort of potential for domestic activity, but we have a high concentration at West Ruislip Golf Course, where we've possible evidence of a roundhouse, and also we've encountered some cremations, and this is one of the areas where we'll be undertaking further work. And the Iron Age, even more interestingly, is entirely absent except for the Hillingdon Hoard. And again, right, Romano-British, relatively limited until we get sort of adjacent to Harville Road at West Ruislip, Ruislip Northern Southern Sustainable Placement, and these are some of the areas I've sort of described. So if you want me to go back, just give me a shout and I can show you where to go back, so we're going back talking about. And also rural industry at the Northern Sustainable Placement. So these are two areas where we're actually depositing the arisings from the tunnels. Now, in terms of the medieval period, we've had a huge amount of evidence, and as I suggested prior to sort of moving, that we've got a lot of, it's kind of manifesting that the area in West Ruislip is actually a relatively sort of old landscape. Certainly on the golf course itself, we have evidence of former field boundaries, of the actual sort of, how should we say, Ickenham Green. And as it suggests here, we found numerous tile kilns, a pottery kiln, and also a kiln, which also discussed that's less clear, where we have evidence of bloomery waste. And again, as it suggests here, there is continued use of one of the tile kilns into the 7th century. So what techniques have we applied? We have enhanced geophysics, which we've undertaken. I'll come to sort of give you an idea of a little bit more about what that is shortly. Evaluation excavation over open trenches to see what we've got and sort of characterise it, record it and establish whether we're required to do any further work or not. And we have construction integrated recording, which is similar but slightly more enhanced than what we'd normally call an archaeological watch and brief, which is basically an archaeologist in front of a machine. But there are a number of caveats and criteria that make it present this as an enhanced strategy, which I won't go into too much detail here because we haven't really used it that much yet. It's one of the sort of methodologies that we only apply if sort of we have a sort of emergency situation or we're in an area that we didn't expect to do any previous work. And also we have excavation and mitigation, which is large scale open area. So in terms of geophysics, there was previous, this is very slow. So in terms of geophysics, there was initially bespoke works taken place ahead of HS2 and ahead of the works by CSJV. And again, this was 34 hectares of work across two areas to the south and north of the current Chiltern line, again, what we call the sustainable placements. And one of the problems with this area is it's on London clay, which is not the ideal medium for geophysics at all. The material is poorly ferrous. The iron it does contain is not the correct sort of iron to get a good signal. It's iron pyrites. We've been asked to reconsider as SGS Railways whether or not there is a sort of any room to manoeuvre with this. And to be honest, I had a long conversation with a very esteemed geophysicist, Chris Gaffney, and we basically sort of come to the conclusion that no further work in sort of using geophysics is likely to be of any assistance. The actual signature, as you can see there, produces what they call too much noise and no sort of evidence of archaeological features. And I can assure you in the area that we have an example of there was quite a bit of archaeology. So instead of geophysics, instead of traditional methods, this is the enhanced methods that I was discussing, and we looked at this particularly in context of the rivers and the streams, because rivers and streams have always presented sort of very favourable areas for human occupation. Obviously, animals go to drink water as much as humans do, so there's a ready and rich source of food and fish and wildfowl. And one of these sort of areas that we have found the mesolithic long blades in, which I'll come to shortly, as I suggested, is on the right banks of the River Pin. And again, this material has been exploited quite readily, and we have evidence of human occupation on the New Year's Bourne, which is this area that you can see here, just south of the Dog's Trust. And what we were looking for when we undertook this enhanced work was these areas where humans might have exploited, such as sort of in-channel, features that would have been in-channel bars, where you have gravels that would have been much drier than the London clay, which is not a particularly favourable substrate for anyone to live on, given the fact it's waterlogged for much of the, particularly in this area, it's waterlogged for much of the year. And unfortunately, again, this didn't particularly yield what we thought was particularly fantastic evidence. But re-interrogating the material, which is with the data, which we sometimes do, we did find that evidence of archaeological features had appeared in the geophysics, albeit sort of very sort of tenuously. And one of the features that we uncovered was one of these kilns that I was talking to you about. So this is a site called Copthall North, which is directly adjacent to Harville Road, where we encountered a 17th to 18th century brick kiln. And again, once we sort of had a look again, it had appeared, but didn't sort of appear in any sort of form that would identify shouted out archaeology, but it was, however tenuously, there. And this feature itself is quite interesting because one of the theories that has been proposed by our archaeological curator is it may have been used to fire bricks for Swakely's house, which is nearby, and Harefield House, which is also nearby. So a further feature that we also sort of identified as after the fact, so to speak, was this further kiln, which is the one that we really don't have any idea what it was actually used for. This whole area now has been subject to large-scale open area investigation. It's been 100% excavated, and this kiln itself still remains enigmatic. But as you can see, this sort of blob here corresponds to the location of the kiln. Now again, in the first instance, interpreting the geophysical data, we looked at it and thought, well, it doesn't look like anything sort of particularly sort of favourable, shall we say. And also the issue we had here is this line here that you can see is actually an 18-inch high pressure gas main, which clouded the signal terribly. And these two gas mains, I have two that run across my site, so I have a 48-inch and an 18-inch, and they have given us some quite interesting geophysical results and some quite interesting problems where we've been trying to excavate. So anyway, to look in more detail at the archaeology itself. Now, I don't unfortunately have a photograph of this, what we believe may be a Mousterian hand axe. This has not been confirmed, and at the moment it still has a question mark over it. But if it is, it would be particularly exciting. And that was encountered on one of our sites where we have employed construction integrated recording, which is a very favourable result for that type of work. And obviously, we'll be investigating that area further when further works take place later on in the year. So the Mesolithic, that's it, I was going to say, the reindeers need to appear. Our first material, as you can see, our oldest, apart from, as I say, our oldest confirmed material is this Mesolithic long blade assemblage. We had 227 flints from a feature here, this is it here, that we believed was a floor or a former working surface. So that was quite exciting. We also had some evidence of hazelnuts from within the fill. And again, this is one of the areas that we'll be going back to have another look. This is, again, as I suggested, on the edges of the River Pin, which sits just where you can see those two people in orange, just behind you there. And it's probably about 50 metres away from the current course. And again, this material dates from just at the end of the end of the last glaciation, when the glaciers have started to retreat completely. But there's still a tundra landscape, and this is, again, there was quite a bit of environmental work undertaken at some of the sites in at Three Ways Wharf that suggested a tundra vegetation and human occupation on the dry gravels. And it's my favourite because it's suggested from some of the animal bone that reindeers roamed in rice slip at that point. So anyway, to progress on to the Bronze Age, as I suggested, the actual sort of earliest episodes, the early and middle Bronze Age, were very, very poorly represented in the area. And we have fantastic evidence of prehistoric activity again at West Rysick, where we'll only be undertaking further work. And we have this lovely possible roundhouse that we're going to investigate, and these two horribly truncated cremations. They're actually earned. It doesn't look like it at the moment. That's a pre-ex picture. I couldn't find that. Sorry, I couldn't find the excavated picture, but it doesn't illuminate the situation to any great degree. But what was particularly interesting about these two cremations was that they actually intercut. One had actually been deposited on top of the other. Initially, it looked like one cremation, but upon investigation, it turned out there was two, and these have been dealt with individually. So anyway, to the Iron Age, which, as I say, is very, very poorly represented, apart from our lovely hoard. Now, part of my role is not just as an archaeologist. When I have archaeologists on site, I also act as what's known as a frontline supervisor, which means I'm responsible for health and safety on site, and I do all the pre-start checks to make sure that everything's safe, that we have a secure working environment where everyone can work safely, and the archaeology can be excavated to the best of our ability. So we'd had no Iron Age evidence, and we hadn't had at this point much archaeology. Most of the archaeology came after this point, and I should say not necessarily associated with the hoard itself. And as it suggests there, all trenches are excavated on a daily basis to make sure they're safe to work in. And on the morning of the 27th of August 2020, it had rained, 28th of August 2020, it had rained very heavily. So I went out to make sure that, largely to establish whether or not it was workable, which it wasn't, because not only do you have the potential for people falling over, it doesn't do best for the archaeology if we're working on clay in wet conditions. So, as we looked at the trenches after the rain, I should say this wasn't one of the trenches, but these little sticks, just to give you an idea what they're for should any sort of amphibians or little small furry creatures fall into the trench, they can escape happily. We also make sure that each end of the trench is ramped so they can also get out of the trenches. And we found that something very special had been revealed by the rain, and there was indeed a treasure at the end of the rainbow. It was there, West Rysick Station. So we were walking on the side of the trench, my colleague and I, and she pointed out sort of a collection of these, it was actually sort of how it manifests there, sort of the appearance of some greenish material, which shouldn't have been there. And as we went down to have a look, we found out it was these small metal discs.
Right, we appear to have lost us, so I don't quite know. What would you suggest next, Jane? Or
I think I can still hear you. I can still hear you, Emma. I can just not.
Right, I'll share from the laptop. I think what's happened is they, in their efforts to secure the right. So I'm just going to stop sharing this. I am. Put you back there. So can you see that now?
No, you stopped sharing and we can't see it anymore.
Right, let me just end show and carry on sharing. Can you see that?
Not yet, no.
What's happened is the generator's gone down.
Oh no. Oh, you're sharing your screen now.
I should be, there you go, have you got that?
Yep.
Yeah, we can see
Right,
that.
there we go,
We can
encouraging
see
the
the
fire.
slide. Yeah, that's good.
Right, so what we did next, so obviously we got more than 10, well, we hadn't obviously got more than 10 coins, but it turned out we got a considerable number of coins. And as I suggested, despite the High Speed Rail Act, the Treasure Act is, any treasure is still reportable under the Treasure Act and is thus governed by common law. So I contacted the coroner to report the find, and then I spoke to the stakeholder at Greater London Archaeological Advisory Service, who also acts on behalf of the London Borough of Hillingdon and the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And it was our stakeholder, Sandy, that let us know it was Potings. He was very excited, as were we. So obviously, when you're sort of you find something of this gravity, you you have to sort of make sure that, again, that we look after it properly, and that we follow the law, and also that we follow best archaeological practice, and then we sort of undertake its curation whilst it's in our care to the best of our ability. So I got on board Pieta, who's an excellent conservator, and David Holman to have a look at the potings to tell us a lot, who's one of the preeminent specialists in the UK and is so knowledgeable about potings, it's incredible. So in the first instance, we sent them for conservation, which Pieta at the time was working at the University of Birmingham, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, and she's now moved to Coventry. And this is an example of some of the potings before we can clean and conserve them. And as you can see, they're in a little bit of a sorry state. So this is Pieta. I'm not going to show that. Will it work? Let's see if it, oh, it's going to work. There you go. So here's Pieta. This is quite sort of cathartic, cleaning these potings. It was a very, I got to clean a couple. Obviously you can tell I'm not from these parts, and I visited Pieta on a couple of occasions to see the works taking place. And it's remarkable that once all the material's been removed, just how bright and shiny they manifest. And there's a clean poting. So this is what they look like. Oh, and this is rejoining. I forgot about that. So we had a number that were fragmentary, which, and we aren't sure whether this happened prior to them being deposited or after deposition, which Pieta rejoined together. And this is an example of what the same few potings that you saw earlier looked like prior to, once they've been cleaned. Now, I don't know whether you know how potings are produced, or even what a poting is. Now, a poting is, we aren't sure whether it was some sort of monetary unit, or it was some sort of representative item of material wealth. But they are commonly deposited at the periphery of settlements, and often, again, sort of a number of sort of you quite commonly find sort of deposits, or possibly ritual deposits associated with watercourses or sort of water within the landscape. Well, in the case of this deposit, we actually did find it at both the periphery of sort of an area of occupation, also in association with an area within a watercourse. So the finding itself and its location was quite interesting. So just to give you an idea how they're produced, you get sort of a strip. They're actually sort of poured. They're not pressed, so to speak. They're poured into excuse me, a mould. And as you can see, you get sort of the where you get the actual sort of lead itself, you get this sort of continuity of strips, and I've forgotten the proper name for them, but there you go. Poting coins to the middle of an end of a strip, and they're called sprues. That's it. So as you can see here, we've got a poting where it's in one of the middle sections, so one of these bits here, and we've also got one that's an end section, so from either here or here. So we got a variety. In the end, there was a total of 320. Again, and here's some of the sort of interesting sort of features that we picked up. We've got one here that's got the edge of a coin still attached to it, and then a poting still attached to it. And this is the development of a poting. Now, again, the actual development is quite interesting because it's actually believed to be the head of Apollo, as you can see here, and this comes from Marseille, which is where they originate. And what happened was they spread across from southern Gaul all the way up to England. And as it sort of migrated, as you can see here, this one is from Kent. Now, again, Potins tend to be found in the southeast of England, and I have an illustration that will show that shortly. But on the reverse is a bull, and as you can see, what this is trying to show is how the potins have changed as they've migrated through both space and time. So we start off with the Kentish potin, which looks more or less the same as the one from Marseille, and then as we go through, you can see where you know, the earlier ones have a reflection that this is a bull and this could possibly be a head, but as it sort of carries on, they get more and more sort of very, you know, away from the actual item they're meant to represent. And I think one of the first ones that we picked up possibly looked like this, because I hadn't got a clue what they were. I mean, I'd never come across anything like this before, and I thought they were Anglo-Saxon because of this highly stylized nature of the actual sort of the coin itself. But as soon as somebody explains this is what happened, again, it sort of starts to make sense. But this is the types present in the Hillingdon hoard, and we have quite an unusual selection actually. And two of them have not previously been identified. And David told me which two they were, and unfortunately I can't remember. But they're quite diverse, and they're from a very sort of specific range of potin production. And again, as you can see, sort of we've got sort of, if you look at the actual sort of the composition of the group, you have two sort of very specific F&G, which are sort of to the end of the production of potins, and a number of sort of quite characteristic subgroups. And if you compare, oh, right, so this is sort of, sorry, that jumped around a little, I'm sorry. So again, we've got some fragmentary examples. And again, this is one of the new variety types, so that's quite handy. And again, you can see, if you sort of compare what we looked at earlier, this is quite a late iteration of a potin. Again, you can see we have variations in the actual process from specific moulds. Again, you can see a flaw caused by produced during casting, and errors in the design where they've not quite worked properly and the ore hasn't flowed into the mould itself. And again, we've got a recut head on the obverse there, where someone's had a sort of a go at improving the quality of the actual potin itself. Now, as you can see, as I suggested, a lot of potins are found in the southeast of England, again, this is a comparison of sort of our hoard with other hoards that have got these sort of F&G groups, which again are quite sort of common across Kent, but are very sort of disappear as you sort of head up towards northwest London, which is where we are. There's one in Essex, so it's actually quite an interesting sort of deposition of the potins itself. Again, I should say at the moment, we're at a very early stage in assessing this work, and literally most of the work is done is to get this sort of to comply with the Treasure Acts and get this sort of to the stage where it can undertake to comply with the legal side of the work, and that further analytical work on the potins will take place at a later stage. So I think it's pretty much the final one. So compared to other linear hoards, we've got a number here: Sunbury, Snettisham, Tetlow and Hillingdon. Apparently of those, the greatest comparison can be drawn between Tetlow and Hillingdon, which is interesting given the fact Tetlow is in Essex and it's probably that outlier that we could see on the previous map. And then finally, we had a large gap between the Iron Age. We have no evidence of Saxon activity, and as I say, Roman was relatively limited. But we had a huge concentration of medieval activity, which is in keeping of this suggestion from the detailed desk-based assessment and also personal observation that we're actually in a very, very historic landscape. And much of the sort of area is still as it was during the medieval period, and we can still see field boundaries and sort of ridge and furrow. In this area, we have one of the few areas of existent ridge and furrow in London within the M25. So the medieval activity, we had this fantastic Hertfordshire ware kiln, which we encountered on one of our sites, which is subject to mitigation. So very large scale open area, everything's been 100% investigated ahead of the works. I think we had 100 buckets of pottery from the site. You can see here the working floors and also the kiln itself. But what was particularly interesting, discussing the fact that we had little evidence of the Romano-British, is that this piece here is actually a piece of Roman kiln furniture, which is intriguing given, as I say, the relative paucity of Romano-British finds across the area. So where did this mysterious piece come from? we still don't know. Hopefully, when we do further work in the area, we're going to find more evidence of the Romans, but that is quite enigmatic and an absolutely beautiful find in itself. In association with a kiln, we found a well, and this is where I get excited because prior to my work as a large-scale infrastructure project, I worked as an environmental archaeologist. We found a huge amount of work wood, as you can see in the well here. This was a piece from either a piece of furniture or a storage box. Another piece of Herefordshire ware that we found beneath this, which gave us a nice date in the 12th century, which was very helpful. And we also had, which is quite unique for a field in the former county of Middlesex, certainly in the middle of one, we had quite a lot of environmental evidence, and we were able to undertake quite a lot of analytical work to look at what the environment surrounding the well was like. The closest environmental material to this site, apart from the mesolithic stuff encountered at Denham and Three Ways Wharf, is actually from Heathrow Terminal 5. So this in itself was quite an exciting find to have this opportunity. So the pollen suggested grassland and mixed deciduous woodland, which is not surprising given the proximity of an existing piece of wood, which has its roots in the medieval period, and of course grassland and probably cereal farming, which we'll come to in a moment. But again, what was particularly interesting in the pollen was the exotics. A number of imported species, such as these hellebores and also these rock crows and peonies, which peonies all of these are introduced species, and most of them were introduced in the early medieval period. And again, also walnuts, which are not indigenous to the UK, suggest there is some form of garden close by. Where this garden is open to, we've debated this quite substantially, but we're not 100% certain. But it's quite the fact that these appear in the pollen record, I think, is quite an interesting indication of possibly the status of some of the other the status of the other sort of houses in the area. We have found evidence of cereal farming. Again, this probably goes back to the grass pollen. So we had oats, barley, and bread wheat again. And rye, again, common species. We had forest species, which included hazelnuts, nice charred hazelnuts there. Some brambles and blackberry, and also evidence of watercress. And then this was my previous speciality, insects, and I was very interested. This corroborates actually, which is quite useful because beetles can be quite unhelpful corroborating sometimes site-specific some of the other evidence. They enhanced our information because we got foul rotting material around the edge of the well. What we haven't got was any evidence of direct evidence of animals. What we have here is an Aphodius dung beetle, which is a bit misleading because they will live amongst rotting vegetation, not necessarily dung. This is an Oxytellus, again, they like similar sort of vegetation, similar material. We had evidence of grassland, so we have a Cytona here, which lives on a variety of grassland species, grasses, and a number of plants. And then a Pteridae, or a click beetle, which are the ones that jump, which, again, also live amongst grassland. And we had evidence of woodland species. This is an Anobium punctatum, which is commonly known as a woodworm. And also this is Leprosinius, and they live amongst broadleaf deciduous woodlands. So we had a really nice picture building here of, surrounding this sort of, this kiln, which appeared to be quite isolated. I think we're looking at rural industrial activity. We couldn't find any evidence of domestic activity at all. There was no evidence of what, in terms of the beetles, they call the house spawner, which is usually used to indicate human occupation, which is a very specific group of beetles that live in quite unpleasant circumstances that would have been representative houses during this period. And it all seems to be all points towards grassland and sort of areas of woodland. And then finally, a more unwelcome visitor was Pulex irritans, which is the human flea, which we also found examples of in their well. So, as it suggests here, what did it tell us? It gave us an idea of medieval land use that was largely cereal crops, and then exploitation evolution of Bayhurst wood, which is this area here. As you can see, this is some of our archaeologists at work. This is the open area excavation I was telling about, where we 100% excavate all archaeology that we encounter. And what did sort of, the pollen sort of gave us some idea that the woodland was dominated by beech. And there's actually a really nice trend, again, further work needs to be taken place, but there seems to be a really nice trend of sort of, you can see that it was coppiced and probably used for charcoal. And you can see this trend sort of where the beach is allowed to sort of re-expand. There's also, you know, as it says, is evidence of dispersed, the evidence of the dispersed settlement of New Year's Green. Do we have a previously recorded sort of deserted medieval village? I think there's certainly sort of some mileage for this, and this is also reflected in the detailed desk-based assessment, which was undertaken the medieval landscape, which clearly indicated from the archives and the historic maps, there was some sort of settlement here that has since disappeared. But where the actual village itself was, or even domestic activity, if it indeed was there, we don't know. All we found is this very sort of evidence of dispersed sort of rural industry. We have the kiln that we're not sure what it was used for, with evidence of bloomery waste, but not much, and also confusing the evidence of possible pottery manufacture, and also this kiln that was clearly used for the manufacture of Hertfordshire ware. And finally, just a quick overview of what we found at West Rytop Golf Course in the medieval period. As I suggested, you can see on this lidar here the ridge and furrow and the former field boundaries, which are absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, these aren't necessarily visible on the ground. You can kind of get the impression of the ridge and furrow here in this area, but not you know, it's not substantial, but in some areas it's a lot more visible, particularly since sort of you know, the golf course apparently was subject to relatively soft landscaping as a result of when it was built, as when it was sort of formed in the 1930s. So it's quite an interesting area to sort of be part of and to be investigated. And as I say, there is further work to be done in this area. So our medieval tile kiln, so just to go back to the 12th, 14th century, was really quite exciting. It was subject to repeated use and final abandonment in the 17th century. We have this beautiful silver long cross penny, which was again found in the edge of the trench here, literally sort of fell out. As I say, this is subject to further work. At the moment, we've just evaluated it, and we will be going back to look at this in greater detail. So again, this gave us an idea of sort of idea of dating. And then finally, it was clearly at one point, take your dog to work day. This is my favourite find from the whole site. And it appeared to be a slender, small-legged dog who sort of run amok probably across his own master's titles prior to firing, and I can imagine it wasn't a very popular puppy that day. But that's the end of my presentation. I'm so sorry about the disturbance. That was a little bit beyond my control tonight. It's usually much quieter than that after 6 o'clock.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was brilliant, and thank you so much for wrestling with all the other engineers in your office. That was remarkably hard. The sound when you moved was absolutely great. There was no echo at all. It was all really, really clear. So it was great to see all the archaeology spoken about very, very clearly.
No, it's I chose the least echoey room. We've got carpet in this one, which helps.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that you've been in a slightly better environment. Great. We will call for questions. I was really pleased actually, because the question I was going to ask you've answered. The potins I find really exciting because they are so weird and abstract.
Yes.
I was very interested to know whether there were some new ones, so it's great to hear that a few new ones have been made. So that was going to be my question. We have one question in the box, which is whether there's been much World War I or World War II ordnance found.
No, not at all. And if you go onto the, we have an extensive UXO program ahead of any of our groundbreaking works taking place anyway. But if you go onto the bomb site website, there's only one bomb dropped, thankfully, in my area, and that's at the River Pin. And that was quite a large piece of high explosive, apparently. So yes, that made a rather large hole. But no, thankfully, we don't. It's actually quite rare to encounter UXO because as a head of a job like this, there's usually been substantial sort of work being undertaken to ensure that there's nothing left there. So no, it's not, no, thankfully.
That's excellent. That's great to hear. Right, a question from Melanie. Could you be more precise about the era of the potins and the habitation in the New Year's Green area?
The habitation New Year's Green, we have all the way from the Neolithic to the medieval period. And in terms of the potings, at the moment, no. And the person to probably pose that to actually would be David, but they appear to be towards the end of the Iron Age, as opposed to sort of any later.
They're normally the last couple of centuries, aren't they, of
Yeah.
the Iron Age?
Yes,
So
they are.
we're looking at the first couple of centuries BC. I think
Yes. Yeah.
it will get refined, Melanie. But I
Yes,
think
it will.
we have another question from Vola, if I've pronounced that right. Can you spell the website again? Or Emma, perhaps you could type it into the chat box to everyone. So copy it in so everyone can see the website to go and have a look at.
Which website's this?
Vola, can you, the bomb site website?
Oh yeah, bomb site, yeah, sorry. Hang on a minute.
Yeah, all the bomb maps for London are available. They may also be on the Layers of London website. So it might be worth looking at the Layers of London website, because that, I'm sure, will have the bombs on. Okay, I don't have any other questions at the moment. So if anyone does have any other questions for Emma, now is the time for that.
I could come in here, Jane, if
you have a question. Yep, go ahead.
Well, it's just, essentially, I'd like to go back to the reindeer. It's not so much a question, but I think if we go back to the discovery, Three Ways Wolf, which Emma mentioned in Uxbridge, where John Lewis and a team found evidence essentially of camps, looking as though they were camped across the Colne at the time that the reindeer were crossing it, and that they were obviously living off the reindeer as they crossed. So we had evidence there, I think, in the late Paleolithic and in the Mesolithic of individuals. And one thing that always struck me about that site, it wasn't being looked at in the context of prehistory. It was being looked at in the context of providing evidence of a major place along the highway between London and Oxford, where negotiations took place between both sides during the Civil War as to trying to get some peace. So Charles was coming down, or Charles's team was coming down from Oxford, and the parliamentarians were coming out of London. But they didn't find much of the house. They found for the first time clear evidence of Mesolithic and earlier activity. And it just did strike me that, you know, essentially Emma has got flints, and she produced a picture of reindeer there. And I suppose it does mean that we've now widened our sights, and we wouldn't only be looking for farms and other activities in the more recent past, but we'd also be looking for how that riverside landscape might have been used during 10 or 12,000 years previously, from the end of the last age and beyond. And as someone who grew up in Pieta, quite close to the River Pin, so a little bit further to the southeast than Emma's team were working, it is quite interesting to think that there may be indications close to the Pin, and indeed at other London rivers like the Crane, of hunter-gatherer groups living off the process of animals as they migrated seasonally, as was the case in Uxbridge. So I think it's just a very interesting example of how work like this can start studying the development of these landscapes from those of the hunter-gatherers. And again, the Mousterian find is very interesting, because it may well mean that if we go back to earlier parts of the Ice Age, and maybe even some of the interstadial periods, that there were evidence of Neanderthals and other human groups in the area too, when the climate was about right to encourage human movements into it. So I thought it was very interesting. And of course, as Emma says, some of these sites will now move on to fuller investigation. So I think it's very important, and I hope, I'd like to wish you better luck, or more luck, as you develop those investigations.
More luck with the presentation, I think.
Well,
I think so.
greater luck in understanding, as it were, from the wider investigations which this work has pinpointed.
We have a couple more questions actually while we're still here, if that's all right. The first one,
Yeah.
brilliant one from Joanna. Did the flea contain any human blood that could be analysed? Right, I think, Emma, can you hear me?
She might be mute. Are you mute, Emma?
She's not muted. I think I'm not sure she can hear us. That's just not got a headphone. Emma, are you there? I think it is unlikely that the flea would have contained enough human blood to be sampled. It will have preserved biologically through the absence of oxygen, but I think the flea would be really quite small, and so extracting blood or DNA would be remarkably difficult. Right, Emma has lost sound. So I think probably I will type the last question, but I think, folks, given the problems that Emma has had tonight, we will probably draw this evening to a close. Harvey, if you could draw the evening to a close while I type it to Emma.
I will do that. Thank you very much, Jane. Well, again, sorry we had so many difficulties. One of the hazards of Zoom presentations, we did retain more than 50 of our 65 people who were here for the lecture, and it was very good that Emma could move to that other room and to present it from there. So I'd like to thank you, Emma, even if you can't hear me. I'd like to thank all those who came tonight too, as members of the audience. I'm sorry that we did have those problems. Let's hope that next time we should be fine. Jane, I think all I would say is thanks to you, and thanks to Louisa, and thanks to all who organised this evening tonight. Thanks to all the audience for coming. To go back to Jane's earlier point, if you are not members of LAMAS, please look at what we do, and if you could join us, that will be great. So thank you very much, Emma. Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you to everybody, Louisa as well, and wish you all a good night. Thank you.